Good morning. We're going to talk about load development for rifle cartridges. The very best components should be used to develop loads. We've got a tremendous selection of bullets. We've got a tremendous selection of powder. We've got a number of cartridge brass manufacturers. We've got wonderful chronographs. I happen to use an Euler Model 33 chronograph. I've used it for years and years and years. It's the earlier Euler Model 33. I continue to use it because it's been so extremely reliable. You must have a chronograph to develop rifle cartridge loads, or pistol loads for that matter. The thing that you need to pay attention to is your chronograph, your velocities, and your accuracy on target. And let's just select, say for instance, a 270 Winchester. I prefer to use Winchester brand or Norma brand cartridge brass for that caliber, because it's been proven to me that those manufacturers of brass probably will potentially give you a load that will shoot a tighter group than somebody else's brass. We've got a great selection of primers. When it comes down to a 270, I always start with a Remington 9.5 primer. Again, it's proven to me that that's probably, as a rule, one of the best primers in the 270. It also could be a Federal 210, a 210 match, or maybe a Winchester large rifle primer. When I develop loads, I'll use all four of those primers to develop a load. I feel that the go-to powders for the 270 Winchester is Reloader 22 or Reloader 26. I found that it gives the highest velocity, the best standard deviations. A standard deviation is the average of a string of 3 shots or 5 shots, whatever it might happen to be. They call it the standard deviation. That's basically a term that was developed and coined by Ken Euler, who developed the Euler chronographs. And I like to use Barnes X triple shocks, Nosler partitions, or Nosler's AccuBond bullets in the 270. 130 is a great bullet in any of those manufacturers' bullet weight for shooting most of our game, and including elk at reasonable range. But the better choice would be a 150 grain Nosler partition if we're going to take elk into the equation. When we load a cartridge, the first thing that we need to do is run our cartridges through a full-length size die, but making sure that we don't push that shoulder back. Almost all manufacturers of brass, especially the 270, is manufactured 2-dimension. It's not over dimension. It's right on dimension to fit properly chambered rifles. A properly adjusted die to where it doesn't push the shoulder back. You deburr your case. I don't do any fancy work in uniforming primer pockets or uniforming flash holes. I find that that's not necessary in developing load for hunting rifles. If we're expecting, say, half minute of angle group, or maybe even better. And I'll start with a charge, look at a loading manual, suggested charges. I'll start maybe a grain or two below their maximum lifted charge. I don't start with a minimum charge. I find that if I start about a grain below their maximum lifted charge in most rifles, start right there. That's a good starting point with those two powders, with any of those bullets. And if I have a load that shows a potential to want to shoot, the first thing that I do, I increase the powder charge a half of a grain. At the same time paying attention to the velocities on the chronograph. If the standard deviation tightened, in other words the extreme velocity spread, which is as an average of the extreme velocity spread, tightens up, let's say that we've got a standard deviation of 20 with a 60 grain load for 130 grain nozzler Accubond in the 270. Add a half a grain, that standard deviation goes from 20 down to 10. I know that I'm heading in the right direction, because the tighter the standard deviation, the more uniformity we have. And uniformity is particularly important when we get downrange. If we don't have uniformity when we get downrange, then we don't have the potential for accuracy. The greater the velocity spread, the larger your groups are going to be at further distance. And that changes the impact of your bullet on the paper. So you could have high shot, you could have a low shot, you could have a shot in between if you've got too tight a velocity spread. So tight standard deviations are very important. Once I get to the point where I think that I've done as well as I can do with the standard deviation, I'm probably have added even another half of a grain, went up to 61 grains. That standard deviation, let's say that it went from 10 to 7. I know that I'm going in the right direction. If it went the other way, then I went past. I need to go back to where I was, to the 60 and a half grain charge, paying attention to the accuracy and my velocity, shoot that one more time and see if it's staying fairly consistent. If it is, the next thing that I'm going to try is switching primers. Started out with a Remington 9.5. The next thing that I'm probably going to try a Federal 210 primer. Now we're going to pay attention to accuracy. We're going to pay attention to our standard deviations on the target. Pay attention to both those things: the target, what the chronograph is reading. The group tightened up, you're on the right track. The group is either going to tighten up or it's going to get bigger. When you change one of these aspects, you change the primer. You change that aspect. Let's say that it was just about the same, it didn't get any better. Well, let's try another primer. Let's try the little bit hotter primer. Let's try the Federal 210 match primer. Let's see what that does. Bingo. Now our groups are tighter. Our standard deviation has went from where we started from 10 to 8. Now it's down to 5. We're headed in the right direction. We've got a match primer. Our accuracy, the accuracy tightened up from, let's say, 5/8 of an inch and went down to 4/10 of an inch. Boy, this rifle's shooting great. We maybe not be able to improve that, but possibly we can. Now we've made a gain. Now maybe we need to tweak our powder charge again. Do we need to tweak that powder charge? Should we try maybe a half a grain less, a half a grain more? Try it. You're not going to know unless you tried it. The next thing is our seating depth. I like to start out seating my bullet about 30 thousandths off the throat, off of touching the rifling in the throat of the barrel. We seem to have a good load combination here now. We're shooting, like 62 grains, 61 grains of reloader 22 with 130 grain nozzler Accubond. We're shooting a Federal 210 match primer. We're shooting 30 thousandths off. Let's shorten that up to 20 thousandths off the rifling. Bingo. Tightens it up about another 1/10 of an inch. Now we're down to about 3/10 of an inch groups with this rifle. Well, that's probably as good as you're going to get in a hunting rifle for a hunting situation with high quality hunting bullets. We should always use hunting bullets. designed for hunting, not match bullets to shoot game. We still have another aspect here. We could shorten up that seating depth to 10 thousandths and see what it does. We seat the bullet 10 thousandths closer to the rifling. Accuracy leaves us. Now we're shooting 3/4 of an inch a group. Our standard deviation went up. That tells us that we went in the wrong direction. If we are loading without a chronograph, you're loading in the dark. It's just like standing in the closet and loading your ammunition. You can't see. You're loading blind. You've got to have a chronograph to develop loads for your rifle. You've got to have reasonably good conditions on a still day, shooting at 100 yards. Once you get all this done, I've got a load developed. It's a good, accurate load. But is it an accurate load? Is it an accurate load? It is at 100 yards, but is it at 300 yards? Let's move a target out to 300 yards. Let's shoot this load that we just developed for this rifle that's shooting 3/10 of an inch. Let's shoot it at 300 yards. Early in the day when our conditions are good, when the light's good, there's not mirage to fiddle with you. Let's shoot it at 300 yards. Now, preferably when you start shooting that far, if you've got a rifle scope with a parallax adjustment on it, move that parallax adjustment to the 300 yard mark and pay attention to your target picture. Your scope, is it good and sharp? It's good and sharp, so everything's fine. A good bench rest on a good set of sandbags. Shoot a 3-shot group. I always work with 3-shot groups with a hunting rifle. Shoot at 300 yards. Now that 3/10 group, we just shot, let's say, a 935 group at 300 yards. Well, you've got a good long range load, because that load is carried out to 300 yards. It's carried roughly the same. It's come up just a little bit, a few thousandths load wise, group measurement wise at 300 yards. You've got a good load. But if that load shot at 300 yards and only shot, let's say, a 2-inch group, did you have a condition change? Do you have air movement? What do you have? Did you have a light change? Was it the load? When you move out to 300 yards, it's tough to chronograph at 300 yards because your chronograph is lined up with a 100-yard target. But when you move to 300 yards, now it's at distance. And because of this, it's hard to chronograph loads at longer range. You could readjust things and chronograph your load and see if that was a problem. But you already had checked and shot that load twice, and it duplicated itself at 100. So it's probably okay at 300 yards. So if that load isn't shooting, I said that it was, but let's assume that it wasn't shooting. Now, what do we need to do? Do we need to change our primer again? Do we need to change our primer again? Is a particular primer going to shoot better at 300 yards in the accuracy area than it did at 100? You don't know unless you try it. This is what load development's all about. And let's just back up and assume that, this Reloader 22 wasn't maybe quite giving you the accuracy that you wanted. Well, one of the very best powders also in the velocity and the accuracy department is Reloader 26. So let's switch. Let's switch and follow the same procedures that I've described to you for Reloader 22. Let's start with Reloader 26. Let's just start right off probably with that suggested, about a grain less than suggested load in the loading manual for 26. Let's try that. Let's repeat the whole process that I've described to you. the changing primers, the seating depth aspects, getting that all worked out, and you got a load that's shooting really well with the Reloader 26. Once you get all these things worked out, move, as I said, to 300 yards, because we need a rifle that'll repeat itself and shoot that same basic minimum of angle. In other words, if it's shooting a half inch at 100, it ought to shoot at least an inch and a half group at 300 yards, because that's maintaining group size. You can still call that a half minute of angle rifle at 300 yards. And those are just simply the simple basics, the simple things to follow while we're developing loads. The other aspect of this, I don't develop a load for anything without having a 1-inch 10th micrometer laying on the shooting bench to measure my case heads. I measure the solid portion of the case head just right ahead of the extractor groove of the case. I measure my cases, my virgin cases. I take that reading, I write it down, and when I fire a particular powder charge, after I fire the case, I again mic that case on the solid portion of the head, and if that case head is expanded some, let's say that it expanded a half a thousandth, well, you're already at a maximum load. You have confirmed on the target with your chronograph that the load shooting it's performing. Well, that's an ideal situation. You have acceptable pressure. Acceptable pressure is allowing a maximum of 1/2 of a thousandth case head expansion with a 1/10 inch 1-inch micrometer. 1/10 mean it reads in 1/10 thousandths of an inch. You follow these procedures. You've followed a procedure of using an instrument to measure your pressure. You're using an instrument to measure your velocity. You're using quality reloading dies and quality components. All these things play the role in developing accurate loads, accurate, safe loads for your rifle. And I always develop loads in the early part of the morning before the temperatures came up. My shooting bench is situated in the shade the early part of the day, the sun being behind me. When the sun comes up, we got, more lit up target. And by mid-morning, I almost always stop any load development or for accuracy and so forth because of condition changes. This gives us the ability, or me the ability, to allow a barrel to sit in the shade. If we've got hot sunlight beating down on a rifle barrel, hot powder being burnt in that barrel, getting a barrel too hot, I'll only shoot a 3-shot string. I'll let the barrel cool completely down. I'll come in, reload my ammunition, try it again, repeat it, whatever I happen to do. This is what load development's all about. It's actually very simple. You can make it just as complicated as you want to, but that's as simple as it is. And you can develop loads for any rifle following the basic procedures that I've outlined to you. There's a lot of other aspects I could go into. Loading manuals give you considerable information on, various things to look for, but these are the better guidelines to follow. And if you're not getting accuracy, you probably have something wrong with your rifle. You have something wrong with your scope. If you follow the procedures that I've outlined, you need to have somebody such as myself, a professional gunsmith, check your rifle. You might have a barrel that's no good. You might have a rifle that's not bedded properly. You might have a scope that's no good. You might have all three at the same time. That's it, folks.